Welcome to the Canadian Beef Cattle Podcast, presented by the Beef Cattle Research Council. The most popular content from beefresearch.ca, available on the go. Before we get into today's episode, a quick message from the BCRC. Carrying capacity, also known as grazing capacity, is the amount of forage a specific pasture produces that is available for grazing animals. Determining a long-term sustainable carrying capacity for pasture is a key component of balancing forage supply and forage demand. To help producers assess and manage carrying capacity, the BCRC developed the Carrying Capacity Calculator, which is available online at beefresearch.ca under Interactive Tools and Calculators or by clicking on the link in the show notes. This episode is titled, When Do I Turn Out My Cows? Managing Spring Pastures During and After Drought. Beef producers will soon be making grazing plans for turning their herds out to spring pastures. While drought planning should be a routine part of development of short and long-term grazing plans, many beef cattle herds have withstood successive years of drought. This has prompted producers to hone in on their management skills to make the best use of their pasture forage and carefully maintain carryover to prevent prolonged damage. The question of, when can I turn my cows out, is an important one, especially for those with dwindling haystacks or for producers purchasing feed. Dr. Edward Bork is a professor of rangeland management in the Faculty of Agricultural, Life and Environmental Sciences at the University of Alberta. He says that aside from spring rainfall, how your pastures looked when you brought the cattle in last fall may be the best indicator of how they will perform in the spring. The better condition the pasture was in October, the faster it will recover, Bork explains. Reduce the long-term impact of drought. With higher winter feed costs, it may be tempting for producers to place cattle in pastures sooner than they normally would, but Bork cautions to be aware of potential long-term consequences. He points out that when we stress forages, we not only affect the above-ground growth, but the below-ground root system as well. Bork explains, deep roots require the most energy to maintain, so they are the first to go, which means that when the roots are not maintained, the plant can lose its ability to draw from deep soil moisture reserves. Those deep roots store energy to keep the plant active during a drought and are also important for long-term survival. Native and tame plants have different root systems. In some cases, native plants appear to bounce back from drought quicker because as long as they are healthy, they have much deeper roots than many tame species. As enticing as it may be to turn cattle out early, or in some cases even just at a normal time, producers should consider holding off if their pastures have been stressed recently. Bork says, by managing pastures cautiously in the short term, we can prevent having to deal with drought-related issues for the next 10 years. Avoiding long-term damage to plant health and root systems will help prevent erosion and even reduce a pasture's risk for weed encroachment. So when do I turn my cows out in the spring? Bork shares some tips for knowing when to turn cattle out and how to make decisions that will support and maintain the long-term productivity of your pastures. Tip number 1, know your carrying capacity. Be realistic with the amount of forage that you have and develop your grazing plan accordingly. Use regional range health guidelines or the BCRC's Carrying Capacity Calculator to estimate the amount of forage available and how many animals a pasture can support. Tip number 2. Wait until the 3-leaf stage. Using plant height is not a good way to determine readiness to grazing as plants can vary greatly by height, especially in the early stages. Instead, wait until the plants have 3 leaves to start grazing. This gives the plant time to build the reserves it needs for long-term survival. A common grazing rule of thumb is that for every 1 day you wait to graze in the spring, you save 2 days in the fall. Tip number 3. Match your grazing plan to your pasture type. If possible, graze tame pastures prior to native pastures. Tame pastures are generally more grazing tolerant and may be quicker to green up in the spring, providing valuable early grazing. In contrast, native grasslands often take longer to reach peak production and therefore should be deferred longer if that is an option. Tip number 4. Pay attention to litter. Litter is the standing or fallen dead plant residue left remaining in a pasture. Bork points out that litter serves multiple purposes on prairie landscapes by conserving rain and snowmelt, but can also be a part of the forage reserve. Pastures with abundant litter will require less recovery and can be accessed earlier in the season than those where there is little to no litter remaining. Grasslands without litter may produce 25 to 60% less forage than grasslands with adequate litter, says Bork. Pastures with reduced litter lose moisture through evaporation and runoff and are at a higher risk of sun and wind exposure. Tip number 5. Look backward. How was your forage maintained in the previous year? If certain pastures were left in poor condition last fall, plan to use those in the following grazing season to allow ample time for rest and recovery. Tip number 6. Use rainfall rather than snow as your indicator of moisture recharge. Although looking at the plants and pastures should be your first indicator for forage growth potential, many beef producers may look to soil moisture levels to help determine pasture turnout. Bork points out that while snow can contribute to moisture recharge, this is not a certainty and may have a limited effect on forage recovery due to its tendency to evaporate, with Chinooks for example, or runoff if soils are frozen. Bork explains, up to 70% of our precipitation in the prairies comes from rainfall in the growing season as opposed to snow, meaning that each year our forage growth is closely tied to the occurrence of May and June rainfall. Bork is also quick to note that when soil moisture is severely depleted by drought the year prior, spring growth will be even more dependent on timely rainfall. And tip number 7, be ready to adapt. Recognize that grazing plans made in early spring are a moving target and will need to be adjusted based on rainfall, heat, and other environmental factors. Monitor pastures through the grazing season and consider what potential backup plans might need to be implemented to ensure pastures are managed for drought resilience. If the pasture isn't ready, what do I do? If producers are faced with drought conditions again, pastures will benefit from extended recovery time. It might be necessary to implement some early steps to prevent long-term damage to pastures. A few tips for this are: Number 1, consider alternative feeds. Are there alternative feeds or byproducts such as soybean hulls, beet pulp, pellets, screenings, or other feed sources that can be used to extend the winter feeding season or as supplements on pasture? You can read the article on utilizing byproducts for more information. The link for that is in the show notes. Number 2, annual forage may fill the gap. Annual forages can be grazed 4 to 6 weeks after seeding and can often be stocked heavily. This strategy may help to alleviate pressure on the grasslands, thereby allowing them to reach their peak growth potential, which can help get your grazing plan back on track. Number 3, determine if destocking is necessary. Making the decision to call is never an easy one, but it can help to reduce reliance on stressed pastures and aid in faster recovery. There's a great article in the show notes that shares tips for making decisions on which cattle to call. And number 4, shorten the breeding season. By shortening your breeding season and pulling bulls sooner, you're selecting for cattle that rebreed earlier, tightening up your calving season, and may be able to take advantage of higher grasser market prices for open heifers. This can help with calling decisions. Managing grasslands through drought is not an easy task, but having a plan going in, monitoring pastures, and being willing to adapt as the weather changes can prevent pasture decline. Facing pasture productivity challenges head-on can help producers be better poised for recovery and reap the rewards when moisture is abundant. Thank you for listening to this week's episode. You can find all relevant links and information at beefresearch.ca or in the show notes. The Beef Cattle Research Council is funded by the Canadian Beef Cattle Checkoff and strives for excellence in the production of Canadian beef, cattle, and forage through research, innovation, and extension. Tune in every Tuesday as the Canadian Beef Cattle Podcast delivers straightforward insights, expert information, and a wealth of practical knowledge for Canadian beef producers. Subscribe now.